When Karoline Leavitt sat down for the interview, she anticipated a discussion. What she didn't foresee was a moment so incendiary it would topple one of the most recognizable TV hosts overnight. It unfolded live, not in some pre-recorded segment where producers could intervene, cut parts out, or polish the rough edges. No, this was unfiltered, unscripted, and happening in real time. Karoline Leavitt had been invited onto The Morning Current, a political talk show renowned for its fiery debates and even fiercer hosts. The man across from her, veteran journalist Paul Danning, had built a career on stirring controversy. His interviews were combative, his style unyielding. He wasn't just there to facilitate, he was there to dominate. And today, his challenger was a young, ascending conservative voice who refused to be intimidated. The segment began as expected. Paul challenged Karoline on her perspective regarding media bias, alleging that conservative outlets spread falsehoods, while networks like his were merely setting the record straight. She fired back with evidence, citing cases where mainstream media had distorted facts, omitted critical details, or outright deceived the public. It was heated but civil. For a moment, it seemed like just another lively exchange, but then the tone shifted. Paul leaned in, his expression hardening, his once measured voice sharpened. He was no longer debating, he was confronting. "People like you," he said, his words laced with irritation, "are the reason this country is regressing. You push this fabricated notion of victimhood, pretending conservatives are being muzzled, when in reality, you're the one silencing everyone else." The studio fell into an uneasy hush. Karoline blinked, her composure unshaken, but her eyes glinted with intensity. She had faced tough interviews before, but this was different. She let the moment linger before speaking. "Excuse me." Paul didn't retreat. In fact, he escalated. "You act like free speech is under siege, but what you truly want is control. Your people." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. Producers, who had been passive observers, now exchanged uneasy glances. Crew members tensed, bracing for what was to come. And Karoline, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't interject. She didn't have to. She simply asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" The tension was thick enough to slice with a blade. Paul hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but that was all it took. The cameras were still rolling. The internet was watching. Paul Danning wasn't a man who retreated easily. His entire career had been built on controlling narratives, steering conversations to his advantage. But this time, he had lost his grip. The moment those two words, "your people," left his mouth, something changed.
It wasn't just an unfortunate choice of words. It was the implication beneath them, the kind of phrase that could be dissected, amplified, and replayed 1,000 times over. And Karoline knew it. She sat back, lacing her fingers together, giving him the space to either rectify his statement or sink further. Paul inhaled sharply. "I meant conservatives," he said. "Too quickly. People like you, who promote a culture of grievance instead of progress." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "So, just to be clear," she said, her voice controlled, "when you said your people, you weren't implying anything beyond political ideology?" Paul's lips pressed into a firm line. He had been in this business long enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. If he pushed back, he risked confirming exactly what people were already suspecting. If he admitted it was a slip, he'd appear weak. So instead, he deflected. "Oh, come on, Karoline." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, perhaps even a fleeting trace of regret. But he was in too deep now. He couldn't afford to backtrack. So, he made a critical mistake. You know what? Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. There it was, a sweeping statement, laced with arrogance, broadcast live. The silence that followed was suffocating, not just in the studio, but on the other side of the screen, where thousands, soon to be millions, were watching. Even Paul seemed to realize it the moment the words left his mouth. His lips parted slightly, as if to soften the impact, but it was too late. Karoline let the moment stretch before responding. Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul? He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. I'm saying this endless whining about being cancelled is exhausting. Karoline nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. But her silence said everything. The damage was done. And within minutes, the clip was everywhere. It didn't take long. The moment the segment ended, the first clips hit social media, a 15-second snippet of Paul Danning's words. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society. No context, no setup. Just that sentence. Within an hour, the hashtags took over. Hashtag Fire Paul Danning, hashtag Media Bias, exposed hashtag Karoline was right. Some took it at face value, calling Paul out for what they saw as blatant disrespect. Others scrambled to defend him, arguing that his words were being misrepresented. But the full-length clip? It didn't help his case. If anything, it made it worse. Political commentators on both sides pounced. Some outright condemned him, while others spun it as yet another example of selective outrage. But regardless of the angle, one thing was certain: people were watching, and then the sponsors got involved. By midday, 3 major advertisers for the Morning Current had suspended their partnerships, releasing carefully worded statements about reviewing their commitments to the network. By evening, 5 more had followed. It was full-scale damage control. And Paul? For his part, Paul Danning stayed quiet, at least for now. But the network? They had a full-blown crisis on their hands. And Karoline? She didn't need to say a word. She simply retweeted the clip, adding nothing but a thinking face emoji. That was all it took. But the storm wasn't over, far from it. Because now, the network had to make a decision. Inside the headquarters of NBS News, the network behind the Morning Current executives were in damage control mode. The outrage wasn't fading, it was gaining momentum. Viewers flooded the network's email inbox, demanding action. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore. They were cutting ties completely. And to make matters worse, other networks had seized the opportunity, using Paul Danning's remarks as a case study in media arrogance. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had 2 options: defend Paul and risk an even bigger backlash, cut him loose and salvage their reputation. For years, Paul had been one of their star personalities, a veteran journalist with a reputation for hard-hitting interviews. But now, he was a liability. At 3 p.m., the official statement was released. Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. NBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. It was corporate speak for. We're waiting to see how bad this gets before we throw him overboard. But the internet? It had zero patience for half measures. The suspension wasn't enough. People wanted him gone. And Karoline? She wasn't leading the charge, but she wasn't stopping it either. That evening, she appeared on another show. She was asked directly, "Do you think Paul Danning should be fired?" She paused, then said, "I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." It was measured, strategic, devastating, because the next morning, NBS News made its final decision. At 9:15 a.m., they announced, effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. And just like that, the media world erupted. Some called it justice. Others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain. Paul Danning was finished. And the conversation? It was only just beginning. Paul Danning was gone, but the controversy was far from over. His firing divided the country in 2. One side saw it as a long-overdue reckoning proof that media figures could no longer talk down to half the country and get away with it. To them, Paul's comments weren't just offensive. They were revealing. A glimpse into the condescending attitude that had defined mainstream media for decades. The other side called it cancel culture at its worst. So a man loses his job over one comment? A single misstep? What happened to debate? What happened to context? Right-wing commentators pounced. Headlines on conservative outlets painted Karoline Leavitt as the woman who took down Paul Danning. Fox News, The Daily Wire, Newsmax, segment after segment, dissecting the firing. Meanwhile, left-leaning voices tried to distance themselves from Paul, but behind closed doors, some were quietly uneasy. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the impact, because if a seasoned journalist could be dismissed overnight, who would be next? Then Paul broke his silence late one night, releasing a pre-recorded statement on social media. His face looked drained, his tone steady but resolute. I was fired because I spoke the truth. The media doesn't seek truth. They seek conformity. If you step out of line, you're gone. If you challenge the narrative, they erase you. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. The video quickly garnered millions of views. Within hours, his supporters mobilized, calling for boycotts against NBS News. His detractors pushed back, arguing that this wasn't part of a grand conspiracy. He had simply overstepped. Karoline, however, stayed silent. She didn't gloat. She didn't fuel the drama. She let the world argue on her behalf. But this had gone beyond Paul. It was now about the future of media itself. The dust was settling, but the questions Paul Danning's dismissal had raised weren't going away. In the days that followed, every major media outlet ran thought-provoking articles and held panel discussions about what had transpired. Was this justice, or was it censorship? Some viewed it as a long-overdue moment of accountability, a sign that elite media figures were no longer untouchable. They argued that Paul's firing wasn't about free speech, it was about professionalism. Words carry weight, and when a journalist crosses the line, they must face the consequences. Simple as that. Others, however, weren't convinced. They warned that the real danger wasn't Paul Danning losing his job, but the implications it held for the future. Are we punishing people for their errors, or are we erasing them for holding unpopular views? The debate expanded far beyond Paul and Karoline. It became about the power of viral outrage, the influence of social media on shaping public perception, and the fragile state of public discourse. As for Paul, he was out but far from finished. Within a month, he launched his own independent show on YouTube, branding himself as a truth teller silenced by the establishment. His audience grew larger than ever. Karoline, meanwhile, moved on, but her name would forever be linked to this moment. She hadn't just debated a TV host. She had shifted the landscape. So, what does this mean for all of us? Was this justice served, or was it a dangerous precedent? Did Paul's firing restore accountability, or did it prove that public pressure wields control over the media? And perhaps most importantly, who decides where the line's drawn? One thing is for certain. This won't be the last time a moment like this occurs. And when it does, the question remains, whose side will you be on? What do you think? Should Paul have been fired, or was this an example of cancel culture gone too far? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think.